Fuck yes! My alien girl harem is all pregnant with my seed, gloated Douglas Wilson to himself as he smugly surveyed the four otherworldly beauties gathered before him, all round with child thanks to his virile human manhood. Just weeks ago, he was an ordinary soldier on a routine mission with his squad to investigate a distress beacon on planet Zephyrus. Now he was the patriarch of a brood of alien-human hybrids that could change the fate of the galaxy. It all started when Douglas found Primus, a stunning Brunali female, as the sole survivor in the wreckage of her crashed ship. Despite the protests of his squad mates who suspected a trap, Douglas insisted on bringing Primus back for medical care. As she recovered, a desperate tale unfolded. Primus was a princess of the Brunali, an advanced but dying race. Civil war had decimated their numbers, leaving mostly females. In a bid for survival, the Brunali had resorted to infiltrating other species and seducing their males to produce offspring. When Douglas's superiors learned of this, they ordered Primus detained and interrogated, but Douglas had grown to care for the alluring alien deeply. Defying orders, he secretly freed her. Now they were both fugitives, seeking out Primus's remaining people in hopes of forging an alliance. Opposition came from all sides, distrustful Brunali factions and fearful human leaders. Time was running out. The future of both species hung in the balance. Douglas knew he might have to sacrifice everything to protect his alien lover and the precious secret she carried within her. 4 alien females swollen with his unborn children. It was every man's fantasy. But for Douglas, it was a heavy burden and a daunting responsibility. He had to navigate a treacherous political minefield to find a path to coexistence for their kinds. Because if he failed, it wouldn't just be his unconventional family that paid the price. It could spell doom for all of humanity and the Brunali. The stakes had never been higher. But looking at his pregnant alien mates, Douglas knew he would do whatever it took, even laying down his own life, to keep them safe and see his offspring brought into the universe. He just prayed he was up to the task, for all their sakes. Douglas and Primus traveled to a hidden moon base, seeking sanctuary among the last remnants of her people. As their ship touched down on the barren surface, they were greeted by a small delegation of Brunali females, their faces etched with a mix of hope and desperation. Among them were Lycia and Nivara, 2 other princesses who had fled the destruction of their homeworld. They ushered Douglas and Primus into the underground compound, a sprawling network of tunnels and chambers that housed the last of the Brunali race. As they settled in, Primus revealed the true nature of Brunali society to Douglas. Our civilization was always led by women, she explained. Males were rare, cherished, but their primary role was to father the next generation. Douglas soon found himself the center of attention, the object of desire for nearly every Brunali female in the colony. Primus, Lycia, and Nivara were the most forward, each vying for his affections in their own way. Lycia was bold and assertive, cornering Douglas in secluded corridors and pressing her lithe body against his. Nivara was more subtle, engaging him in deep conversations and intellectual debates, her eyes smoldering with barely restrained passion. And Primus, his first love, redoubled her efforts to keep him by her side. At first, Douglas resisted their advances, torn between his loyalty to his mission and the intoxicating allure of the alien princesses. But as he spent more time among the Brunali, witnessing their struggle and their indomitable spirit in the face of extinction, his perseverance began to waver. The princesses were relentless in their pursuit, explaining to Douglas the vital role he could play in their species' survival. With our technology, a single human male could father hundreds of offspring, Lycia purred, trailing a finger along his chest. You could be the savior of our race, Douglas. The weight of that responsibility bore down on him. To abandon his duty, to turn his back on his own kind and devote himself to the Brunali, it was an impossible choice. Yet the more he came to understand and admire these remarkable alien women, the more he felt drawn to their cause. As he worked alongside them to build a new home, a new future, Douglas found himself falling for each princess in turn. Lycia's fiery passion, Navarra's keen intellect, Primus's unwavering devotion. He saw in them everything he had ever wanted in a partner, and more. And so, with a heavy heart and a soaring spirit, Douglas made the decision that would define the rest of his life. In a ceremony steeped in Brunali tradition, he took Primus, Lycia, and Navarra as his brides, pledging himself to them and to the future of their species. As he lay with each of his new wives in turn, their bodies joining in a symphony of passion and purpose, Douglas felt a sense of rightness, of destiny. And when, weeks later, all three princesses came to him with the joyous news of their pregnancies, he wept tears of pride and love. But their happiness was short-lived. A squad of human soldiers, dispatched to bring the renegade Douglas to justice, had tracked them to the hidden moon base. They stormed the compound, weapons drawn, demanding the surrender of the traitorous soldier and his alien consorts. In that moment, Douglas knew with absolute clarity where he belonged. He stood before his Brunali family, shielding them with his own body, and faced down his former comrades. "I won't let you harm them," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "I am Kyle Krath, defender of the Brunali, father to the future. This is my home now, my family, and I will fight for them to my last breath." The air crackled with tension as Douglas faced down his former comrades. Commander Briggs' voice boomed across the chamber. "Wilson, you're outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender the aliens and return with us to face justice." Douglas planted his feet firmly, shielding his pregnant Brunali mates with his body. "No can do, Commander. These women are my family now. I won't let you harm them." Briggs' face contorted with anger. "Damn it, Wilson. This is treason." "Call it what you want," Douglas shot back, "but I'm not budging." Suddenly, the far wall exploded inward. Through the dust and debris strode a group of tall, lithe figures. Brunali warriors, their iridescent skin gleaming under the harsh lights. At their head was a male who bore a striking resemblance to Lycia. "Tyron!" Lycia cried out. The Brunali leader's eyes locked onto Douglas. For a heartbeat, the two sized each other up. Then Tyron gave a curt nod and raised his weapon. "Protect the females." Chaos erupted as energy beams crisscrossed the chamber. Douglas found himself fighting alongside Tyron, the two moving in perfect sync. A stray shot nearly took Tyron's head off, but Douglas tackled him to safety. "Thanks," Tyron grunted. "Don't mention it," Douglas replied, squeezing off another round. A pained cry cut through the din. Douglas whirled to see Primus doubled over, clutching her swollen belly. "The baby," she gasped. "It's coming." Douglas's heart raced. He glanced from Primus to the raging battle and back. With a muttered curse, he scooped her up and carried her to a sheltered alcove. "Lycia, Navarre, I need you." The other two Brunali females rushed to his side. Together they worked to bring Douglas's child into the world amidst the chaos of battle. Douglas cradled Primus's head, murmuring words of encouragement as she strained and pushed. With a final guttural cry, Primus gave birth. Douglas caught the tiny wriggling form in his hands, his breath caught as he beheld his daughter, unmistakably a blend of human and Brunali. "She's beautiful," he whispered. The newborn's wails pierced the air, momentarily halting the conflict. All eyes turned to the miracle of new life. In that instant, Private Hawkins lowered his weapon. "This is wrong," he declared, moving to stand beside Douglas. "We shouldn't be fighting them." His defection sparked a chain reaction. More soldiers hesitated, clearly conflicted. Douglas seized the moment. Handing the baby to Primus, he stood tall. "Commander Briggs, this doesn't have to end in bloodshed. The Brunali aren't our enemies. They could be our greatest allies." Briggs wavered, his gaze fixated on the newborn. The hard lines of his face softened almost imperceptibly. Douglas pressed on. "Look around you. This is the future. Human and Brunali, united. Think of the possibilities." For several tense heartbeats, no one moved. Then, slowly, Briggs lowered his weapon. "Stand down," he ordered his remaining men. As the adrenaline of battle faded, the reality of what had transpired began to sink in. Douglas surveyed the chamber, scoring marks on the walls, the acrid scent of ozone, and worst of all, the still forms of fallen warriors from both sides. Tyron approached, his expression a mix of grief and gratitude. "You fought well, human. You saved my life. For that, I owe you a debt." Douglas clasped the Brunali's forearm. "No debt. We're family now." Primus called out weakly, cradling their newborn. Douglas rushed to her side, marveling at the tiny life they'd created. "What shall we name her?" Primus asked. Douglas smiled, a fierce protectiveness welling up inside him. "Hope. Her name is Hope." As Licia and Navarra fussed over Primus and the baby, Douglas turned to face Briggs. The commander's face was unreadable. "This isn't over, Wilson," Briggs said quietly. "But for now, we'll withdraw." Douglas nodded, knowing this reprieve was temporary at best. As the human soldiers filed out, he caught Hawkins's eye. The young private gave him a respectful nod before disappearing into the tunnels. In the aftermath, Douglas found himself surrounded by his new family. Tyron clasped his shoulder. "You've more than proven yourself, Douglas. My warriors and I pledge our support to you and this colony." Douglas looked around at the battered chamber, at Primus nursing their daughter, at Licia and Navarra with their own swollen bellies. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us," he said. "This place needs to be fortified, supplies gathered, and we need to be ready for when they come back." As the others set about tending to the wounded and assessing the damage, Douglas took a moment to hold his newborn daughter. Looking into her eyes, a mesmerizing blend of human and Brunali, he felt a surge of love and persistence. "I promise you," he whispered to Hope, "I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. All of you." In the weeks following the confrontation with Commander Briggs, a fragile peace settled over the Brunali colony. Douglas spent his days fortifying their defenses and his nights tending to his growing family. Navarra and Licia's pregnancies progressed rapidly, their bellies swelling with new life. One evening, as Douglas cradled Hope in his arms, Navarra's labor began. Her cries echoed through the tunnels as Douglas and Licia rushed to her side. Hours of intense contractions followed, until finally, with a triumphant shriek, Navarra brought forth a son. Douglas cut the umbilical cord, his hands trembling as he held his newborn boy. Just days later, Licia went into labor as well. The birth was difficult, but with Douglas by her side, offering words of encouragement and support, she too delivered a healthy son. As Douglas gazed upon his children, Hope, with her iridescent skin and human eyes, and his two sons, each a unique blend of Brunali and human features, he felt a surge of love and pride unlike anything he'd ever known. The colony celebrated the new arrivals, but their joy was short-lived. News of Douglas's hybrid offspring spread like wildfire through human space. The reaction was swift and brutal. "Traitor to humanity!" The words blared from every view screen and comm channel. Douglas watched in horror as human authorities denounced him and his children as abominations. The vitriol in their voices chilled him to the bone. "We need to prepare," Tyron said grimly, his eyes fixed on the broadcasts. "They'll be coming for us." Douglas nodded, his heart made with persistence. They worked tirelessly, reinforcing the colony's defenses and training every able-bodied Brunali to fight. But even as they prepared for the worst, Douglas hoped against hope that it wouldn't come to bloodshed. His hopes were dashed on a moonless night when alarms blared through the colony. "Intruders detected," Tyron's voice crackled over the comm. "All warriors to battle stations." Douglas sprinted to the nursery, where Primus, Navarra, and Licia huddled with the children. "Get to the safe room," he ordered, kissing each of them fiercely. "I'll come for you when it's over." The sounds of battle echoed through the tunnels as Douglas raced to join the defense. Plasma bolts sizzled past his head as he dove into cover beside Tyron. "How many?" he shouted over the din. "Too many." Tyron fired off a volley, downing two attackers. "But we know these tunnels better than they do. We can use that to our advantage. Douglas nodded, his mind racing. He directed groups of Brunali warriors to key choke points, using their superior knowledge of the terrain to ambush the human soldiers. The strategy worked, for a time. But the attackers kept coming, wave after relentless wave. In the chaos of battle, Douglas lost track of time. His world narrowed to the rhythm of combat. Duck, fire, reload, repeat. Sweat stung his eyes and his arms ached from the constant recoil of his weapon. But he pushed on, driven by the knowledge that his family's survival hung in the balance. A scream of pain cut through the din. Douglas whirled to see a human soldier crumple to the ground, revealing a towering figure behind him, Colonel Vance. The man's eyes locked onto Douglas, a cruel smile twisting his features. "Wilson," Vance bellowed, "I'm coming for you and your alien spawn." Ice gripped Douglas's heart as he realized Vance was heading for the inner sanctum, where Primus and the children were hidden. With a roar of fury, Douglas charged after him, ducking and weaving through the battle-torn corridors. He burst into the safe room just as Vance was advancing on Primus, who clutched Hope protectively to her chest. Without hesitation, Douglas hurled himself at the larger man, tackling him to the ground. They grappled fiercely, each fighting with the desperation of men with everything to lose. Vance was stronger, his blows raining down on Douglas with bone-crushing force. But as Douglas caught sight of his children's terrified faces, something primal awoke within him. With a surge of paternal rage, Douglas broke free of Vance's grip. His fist connected with the colonel's jaw, sending him staggering backward. Before Vance could recover, Douglas pressed his advantage, delivering a flurry of punches that drove the larger man to his knees. "It's over, Vance," Douglas panted, standing over his defeated foe. "Call off your men." But Vance wasn't finished. With a snarl, he lunged for his fallen weapon. Time seemed to slow as Douglas saw the barrel swing towards him. A blur of motion, a deafening blast. Douglas stumbled backward, expecting pain, but it never came. Instead, he watched in horror as Tyron crumpled to the ground, a smoking hole in his chest where he had intercepted the shot meant for Douglas. "No!" Douglas cried out, catching his friend as he fell. Tyron's eyes met his, a faint smile on his lips. "Protect them," he whispered, before the light faded from his eyes. Grief and rage warred within Douglas as he gently laid Tyron's body down. He turned to face Vance, who was already scrambling to his feet. But before either could make a move, a voice crackled over Vance's comm. "Colonel, we're overrun. We need to fall back." Vance's face contorted with fury, but even he could see the battle was lost. With a final venomous glare at Douglas, he retreated, barking orders for his remaining forces to withdraw. In the aftermath, Douglas surveyed the devastation. The colony lay in ruins, the tunnels scarred by weapon fire and strewn with the bodies of fallen warriors, both Brunali and human. But as he gathered his family close, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had survived. His children were safe. Days later, they gathered to lay Tyron and the other fallen to rest. Douglas stood before the assembled Brunali, his voice thick with emotion as he delivered the eulogy. "Tyron was more than just a friend," he began. "He was a brother, a hero. He gave his life so that our children, the future of both our peoples, might live." Douglas gazed at the hybrid infants in their mother's arms. "I swear to you, Tyron, your sacrifice will not be in vain. These children will grow to embody the best of both our races. They will be the bridge that unites us, the proof that we are stronger together than apart." As the solemn ceremony concluded, Douglas knew they couldn't stay. The colony was compromised, and it was only a matter of time before more human forces arrived. "We need to leave," he told Primus, Nivara, and Lysia. "Find somewhere safe to raise our children." The Brunali females nodded, their faces set with persistence. "We go where you go," Primus said firmly. "Our place is by your side." Under the cover of darkness, they set out. The exodus was grueling, made all the more challenging by the need to care for the infants. They moved in fits and starts, constantly on alert for signs of pursuit. Their vigilance paid off when they narrowly avoided an ambush by a human patrol. As they crouched in the shadows, hearts pounding, Douglas feared all was lost. But salvation came from an unexpected quarter. A group of Brunali warriors seemed to materialize out of the darkness, their weapons trained on the human soldiers. In a brief but intense firefight, they drove off the patrol. As the dust settled, a tall, fierce-looking Brunali female approached. "I am Zara," she announced. "We've been tracking your group for some time." Her eyes fell on the hybrid children, and a hint of wonder crept into her voice. "So it's true. You've done what many thought impossible." Douglas stepped forward, hope cradled in his arms. "We seek refuge," he said simply. Zara studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Come," she said. "Our clan roams the stars. We can offer you sanctuary, for a time at least." As they followed Zara and her nomads to their hidden ship, Douglas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They weren't safe, not yet, but for the first time since fleeing the colony, he dared to hope that they might find a place where his unconventional family could thrive. Boarding the ship, Douglas gazed out at the stars. Somewhere out there was a future where humans and Brunali could coexist, where his children could grow up free from persecution, and he was going to find it, whatever it takes. The Brunali ship glided through the stars, its battered hull a testament to the trials they'd endured. Douglas stood at the viewport, his hand resting on the cool metal frame as he watched unfamiliar constellations drift by. Behind him, the soft murmur of Brunali voices filled the air. Zara approached, her footsteps nearly silent on the ship's deck. She stood beside him, her piercing gaze fixed on the void beyond. "You've proven yourself a true warrior," she said, her voice low. "But trust is hard won among our people." Douglas turned to face her, rolling up his sleeve to reveal the fresh scar on his forearm. "I understand," he said. "What must I do?" Zara's eyes narrowed. "Our most sacred ritual, blood of my blood, life bound to life." She produced a gleaming ceremonial dagger, its blade etched with ancient Brunali script. Douglas nodded, extending his arm without hesitation. The blade bit deep, and he pursed his lips against the pain as crimson welled from the wound. Zara leaned in, her lips brushing his skin as she drank. The act was intimate, primal, and Douglas felt a strange connection forming between them. When she straightened, her eyes blazed with newfound respect. "Brother," she said simply, clasping his shoulder. Days later, their ship touched down on a desolate moon. Craggy peaks stretched toward a starless sky, and icy winds howled across barren plains. Douglas helped erect shelters, his muscles aching from the unaccustomed labor. As they fortified their new haven, Zara approached, her face grim. "Scouts report human ships in the sector," she said. "We may have been tracked." Before Douglas could respond, the sky erupted in fire. Plasma bolts rained down, vaporizing rock and turning sand to glass. Panicked cries filled the air as Brunali scrambled for cover. "The children!" Douglas shouted, sprinting toward the nursery shelter. He scooped up Hope, her tiny form warm against his chest. Primus, Nivara, and Lycia followed, each clutching a wailing infant. "This way!" Zara bellowed over the din, gesturing toward a yawning cave mouth. They plunged into darkness, the rock walls vibrating with each impact. Outside, the battle raged. Zara and Douglas led hit-and-run attacks, using the moon's treacherous terrain to their advantage. Human soldiers fell to precision shots and brutal ambushes, but more kept coming. A familiar voice crackled over a discarded comm unit. "Wilson!" Colonel Vance snarled. "I know you're here!" Douglas' blood ran cold as he saw Vance gesturing toward the cave. "No," he whispered. The cave mouth exploded inward, showering them with razor-sharp shards. Acrid smoke filled the air, and Douglas's eyes burned as he struggled to see through the haze. "We have to move!" he shouted, coughing. "The radiation—" They stumbled from the ruined shelter, precious bundles clutched tight. Primus thrust a breathing mask into Douglas's hands, her eyes wide with fear. He helped her secure her own mask before donning his, the filtered air tasting stale and metallic. They ran, boots crunching over irradiated soil. Navara stumbled and Douglas caught her arm. Her son hung limp in her grasp, his tiny chest still. "No," Navara moaned, her voice muffled by her mask. "No, no, no." Douglas pulled her close, his own grief threatening to overwhelm him. But they couldn't stop. Not here, not now. They pressed on, each step an agony of fear and exhaustion. The barren landscape stretched endlessly before them, offering no shelter, no respite. A low hum cut through the howling wind. Douglas looked up, his heart leaping at the sight of a battered Brunali cruiser descending from the clouds. The loading ramp lowered, revealing a regal figure silhouetted against the ship's interior lights. "Father!" Licia cried, her voice cracking with emotion. The Brunali king's eyes widened as he took in the ragtag group. "My daughters," he breathed, "and grandchildren?" There was no time for explanations. They scrambled aboard, the ship already rising as the ramp sealed shut. Through the viewport, Douglas watched Vance's troops give chase, their weapons flashing uselessly against the cruiser's shields. A new fleet suddenly warped into view, weapons blazing. Douglas recognized the lead ship with a jolt of surprise. "Briggs," he muttered. As the rival human factions clashed, the Brunali ship slipped away, stars blurring into streaks of light as they jumped to hyperspeed. Douglas sagged against the bulkhead, exhaustion finally overtaking him. The Brunali king approached, his expression a mix of wonder and concern as he gazed at the hybrid children. "You've suffered much," he said softly. "But I swear to you, you will find sanctuary among our people." Douglas nodded, too weary for words. As the ship hurtled toward the outer reaches of the galaxy, he allowed himself a moment of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The Brunali king's ship shuddered as it tore through the fabric of space-time. Douglas clutched hope tightly, his eyes fixed on the swirling vortex outside the view screen. Weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and constant vigilance. Finally, the ship dropped out of hyperspace near a desolate planetoid. Its surface was pockmarked with craters, a harsh landscape of jutting rocks and deep crevasses. As they descended, Douglas spotted clusters of crude shelters nestled in the shadows of towering cliffs. The moment they touched down, a crowd of Brunali surrounded the ship. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollow from years of hardship. As Douglas emerged with Primus and the children, a hush fell over the gathering. "Abominations!" someone shouted, breaking the silence. Others took up the cry, pressing forward with clenched fists. The Brunali king strode down the ramp, his presence commanding instant respect. "Enough!" he bellowed. "These are my daughters and their chosen mate. The children are under my protection." The crowd parted reluctantly, allowing Douglas and his family to pass. They were led to a squat, fortified building on the outskirts of the settlement. Armed guards took up positions at every entrance. Days passed in tense isolation. Douglas paced the confines of their shelter, feeling like a caged animal. Outside, he could hear the constant murmur of discontent from the Brunali populace. One night, the calm shattered. An explosion rocked the building, showering them with debris. Through the smoke, Douglas saw masked figures pouring in, weapons raised. "Protect the children," he shouted, diving for cover as energy blasts scorched the air around him. Navara scooped up two of the infants, shielding them with her body as she ran. A stray bolt caught her in the back, and she crumpled with a cry of pain. Douglas grabbed a fallen weapon, returning fire as he dragged Navara to safety. Primus and Licia worked frantically to stem the bleeding, their hands slick with purple Brunali blood. The firefight raged on, loyal Brunali warriors joining the fray. Douglas fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, every shot aimed to protect his family. When the last attacker fell, an eerie silence descended. Douglas rushed to Navara's side, his heart in his throat. She lay still, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Stay with us," Primus pleaded, applying pressure to the wound. Before they could celebrate their narrow escape, alarms blared throughout the settlement. A breathless scout burst in, his eyes wide with terror. "Human ships!" he gasped. "A massive fleet, led by a warship unlike anything we've ever seen." Douglas's blood ran cold. He knew without a doubt who commanded that fleet. The Brunali king entered, his face grim. "There's no time to evacuate," he said, "but we have one last option." He led them to a cavernous underground chamber. At its center stood a massive device, its surface covered in pulsing lights and crackling energy. "A reality rift generator," the king explained. "It can open gateways to other dimensions. It's untested, but it's our only hope." Douglas stepped forward without hesitation. "I'll go," he said. "I'll lead the team to power it up." Primus grabbed his arm, her eyes pleading. "You can't! It's too dangerous!" Douglas cupped her face gently. "I have to," he said softly. "For our children. For all of us." He kissed each of his mates and children, committing their faces to memory. Then, with a final look back, he followed the king's elite guard into the bowels of the machine. Above, the first volleys from Vance's fleet lit up the sky, heralding the start of what could be humanity's final battle against the Brunali. The sky above the Brunali outpost erupted in a hellish inferno as Vance's fleet unleashed its fury. Plasma bolts seared the air, vaporizing buildings and turning the ground to molten slag. Douglas sprinted through the chaos, the Brunali king and his elite guard at his heels. Acrid smoke burned his lungs as they weaved through collapsing structures. "The quantum core is just ahead," the king shouted over the din of battle. They rounded a corner and froze. A squad of Vance's shock troopers blocked their path, weapons raised. Douglas dove for cover as energy beams sliced through the air. The Brunali guardsmen returned fire, their precision shots dropping several humans. But more kept coming. Douglas spotted a gap in the enemy line. "This way!" he yelled, leading a desperate charge. He tackled a trooper, wresting the weapon from his grasp and firing point blank. The king's guard formed a protective circle, their bodies a living shield as they fought their way forward. They burst into the quantum core chamber, the massive rift generator looming before them. Douglas raced to the control panel, his fingers flying over unfamiliar symbols. The ancient machine thrummed to life, arcs of energy crackling across its surface. A warning klaxon blared. Douglas spun to see Kolvek and his purist Brunali storming the room, their faces twisted with hate. "Traitor!" Kolvek spat, raising his weapon. The Brunali king lunged, shoving Douglas aside as a barrage of energy bolts tore into his chest. He crumpled to the floor, purple blood pooling beneath him. "No!" Douglas cried, scrambling to the fallen monarch's side. The king grasped Douglas's hand, his breath ragged. "Protect my people," he gasped. "The future is yours now." His eyes glazed over, and Douglas felt a piece of himself die with the noble ruler. Grief threatened to overwhelm him, but the rift generator's urgent pulsing snapped him back to reality. He threw himself at the controls, fingers dancing across the panel as Kolvek's forces swarmed closer. A blinding light filled the chamber as reality itself tore open. The shimmering rift beckoned, a gateway to salvation. "Primus! Lysia!" Douglas shouted into his comm unit. "Get everyone to the rift now!" He turned to face Kolvek's oncoming horde, snatching up a fallen weapon. The remaining royal guards formed a last line of defense as Douglas worked furiously to stabilize the portal. Brunali refugees streamed into the room, Primus and Lysia herding them toward safety. Douglas caught glimpses of his family through the melee. Hope cradled in Primus's arms, the other children wide-eyed with terror. "Douglas, come on," Primus pleaded, one foot in the rift. He shook his head, firing another volley at the advancing purists. "I have to hold it open. Go!" The battle raged on, Douglas and the guards fighting with desperate fury. His muscles screamed with exertion as he felled foe after foe, buying precious seconds for more Brunali to escape. A primal roar cut through the din. Kolvek charged forward, eyes blazing with hatred. Douglas met him head-on. their weapons clashing in a shower of sparks. They grappled, evenly matched as the world crumbled around them. Douglas felt his strength flagging, Kolvek's superior size pressing the advantage. But then he caught sight of Hope's face, vanishing into the rift. Rage and love surged through him. With a final burst of strength, he twisted, hurling Kolvek bodily into the unstable vortex. The purist's scream was cut short as he vanished into the unknown. Warning lights flashed across the generator's displays. The rift was destabilizing, seconds from collapse. Douglas staggered to the controls, pouring every ounce of his being into maintaining the portal. "Douglas!" Primus's anguished cry tore at his heart. She stood at the rift's edge, hand outstretched. Their eyes met one final time. He saw a lifetime of love, of possibility in that gaze. Then the generator overloaded in a blinding flash. Searing pain enveloped Douglas as the world dissolved around him. He felt himself falling, tumbling through an impossible void. Then, nothing. An eternity later, Douglas's eyes fluttered open. Humid air filled his lungs as he struggled to focus. Towering alien trees stretched toward an unfamiliar sky. His body ached, but he was alive. Somewhere, across an unimaginable gulf, his family believed him dead. But Douglas Wilson had survived the impossible before. He pushed himself to his feet, scanning the alien jungle for threats. "I'm coming home," he whispered, "no matter what it takes." Douglas gasped as consciousness slammed back into him. His head throbbed, and every breath sent daggers of pain through his chest. Thick, humid air pressed down on him as he struggled to focus. Towering alien trees stretched toward an unfamiliar sky, their canopy filtering strange, reddish light. He tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled with weakness. A quick glance revealed the source of his labored breathing. A jagged tear ran across his chest plate, exposing him to the alien atmosphere. Douglas fumbled with shaking hands, activating the suit's emergency sealant. The breach hissed shut, but the damage was done. As his vision cleared, movement caught his eye. A low growl rumbled from the underbrush. Douglas froze, adrenaline surging through his battered body. A scaled reptilian head emerged, followed by another, and another. Douglas scrambled backward, his fingers scrabbling in the loamy soil for anything he could use as a weapon. The lead predator lunged, jaws snapping shut inches from his face. He rolled, feeling claws rake across his back. Pain exploded through him, but survival instinct took over. He sprinted through the dense foliage, branches whipping his face. The beasts crashed after him, their hungry snarls spurring him onward. Douglas's lungs burned as he pushed his body to its limits. He vaulted over fallen logs, splashed through murky streams, always staying just ahead of snapping jaws. A rocky outcropping loomed ahead. Douglas spotted a narrow opening and dove inside without hesitation. The predators slammed against the entrance, too large to follow. Their frustrated howls echoed through the cave as Douglas crawled deeper into the darkness. He collapsed against the cool stone, chest heaving. As the adrenaline faded, the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. Stranded, alone, no way to contact Primus, Lysia, or any of the Brunali survivors. Douglas fought back the wave of despair threatening to overwhelm him. He couldn't give up. His family was out there somewhere, believing him dead. He had to find a way back to them. With grim willpower, he tore strips from his ruined uniform, fashioning crude bandages for his wounds. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain through his battered body, but Douglas pushed through it. He'd survived worse. As the alien sun set, painting the sky in unfamiliar hues, Douglas ventured from his shelter. He gathered what edible plants he could identify, relying on his survival training. A stream provided fresh water, which he purified using his suit's filtration system. Days bled into weeks as Douglas adapted to the merciless wilderness. He crafted makeshift spears and snares, supplementing his meager diet with small game. The predators continued to hunt him, but he learned their patterns, using the jungle's dense foliage to his advantage. His military instincts kicked in as he began to explore further afield, always alert for any sign of technology or civilization that might aid his escape. Hope dimmed with each fruitless expedition, but Douglas refused to give in to despair. Then, on a sweltering afternoon, he stumbled upon something that didn't belong in this primordial world. Half buried in vines and decay lay the unmistakable shape of a spacecraft. Not Brunali in design, but far more ancient and ornate. Douglas approached cautiously, his improvised spear at the ready. The ship's hull was scarred and pitted, evidence of its age. As he cleared away the overgrowth, his fingers traced intricate patterns etched into the metal, writing in no language he recognized. He found a hatch, and with great effort managed to wrench it open. Stale air rushed out as Douglas peered into the darkened interior. His heart raced with a mixture of fear and excitement as he stepped inside, ready to face whatever secrets this alien vessel might hold. Douglas stood at the rift's edge, his heart pounding as the first Brunali refugees emerged. Primus burst through, her eyes scanning frantically until they locked onto his. She sprinted toward him, cradling a tiny bundle. "Douglas!" she cried, colliding with his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, inhaling her familiar scent. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Primus pulled back, tears glistening in her eyes. "Meet Alara," she said, tilting the bundle. A pair of wide, inquisitive eyes, one human, one Brunali, peered up at him. Douglas's breath caught in his throat. He gently traced a finger along Alara's cheek, marveling at the perfect blend of human and Brunali features. A metallic voice interrupted their reunion. "Welcome, new arrivals." Ivan's holographic form materialized nearby. "I am Ivan, the AI tasked with overseeing your integration and advancement on this world." The AI launched into an explanation of the evolutionary uplift process, emphasizing its importance for the Brunali's future. As Ivan spoke, Douglas noticed a growing unease among some of the refugees. "What about our children?" a Brunali mother called out, clutching her pure-blooded offspring close. "Why are they excluded?" Before Douglas could respond, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. A distant rumble grew to a deafening roar as the colony's moon erupted in a spectacular volcanic display. "Earthquake!" Douglas shouted, steadying Primus as she clung to Alara. "Ivan, status report!" The AI's voice remained calm amid the chaos. "Structural integrity of key facilities compromised. Radiation shielding failing in nursery sectors." Douglas sprang into action, issuing rapid-fire orders to the Brunali guards. "Form teams! We need to reinforce those nurseries now!" He worked alongside Evan, rerouting power and erecting emergency force fields around the most vulnerable areas. As they labored, alarms blared throughout the compound. "Alert!" Ivan announced. "Unauthorized access detected in power relay stations." Douglas cursed, recognizing Kolvek's hand in this sabotage attempt. He assembled a strike team of elite Brunali guards, their faces grim as they followed him toward the compromised relay station. Energy bolts sizzled past Douglas's head as they breached the facility. He dove for cover, returning fire with precision. The air crackled with ozone as the two factions clashed, neither side willing to yield. "Push forward," Douglas ordered, leading a flanking maneuver that caught the saboteurs off guard. In a furious exchange of fire, they drove Kolvek's forces back, securing the vital power relays. With the immediate threats neutralized, Douglas returned to the nursery complex. He found Primus cradling Alara, who was undergoing her first accelerated growth treatment. The infant's body pulsed with an otherworldly glow, her limbs elongating before his eyes. "It's incredible," Primus breathed, awe and fear mingling in her voice. Douglas watched in fascination as Alara's eyes focused on him with startling clarity. Her tiny mouth opened, forming words far beyond her apparent age. "Father," she said, her voice a melodic blend of human and Brunali tones. "I understand now. The quantum entanglement of our genetic codes, the fractal patterns of our neural pathways. It's beautiful." Douglas staggered back, overwhelmed by the implications of what he was witnessing. As the days passed, He found himself engaged in deep philosophical discussions with children who, by all rights, should still be in diapers. But not everyone shared his wonder. Whispers of discontent grew among the pure-blooded Brunali, fueled by Kolvek's rhetoric. The tension finally snapped one night as alarms blared through the compound. Douglas raced toward the nursery, his heart in his throat. He arrived to find a scene of carnage, Brunali guards locked in combat with Kolvek's purists. To his horror, he saw several of the attackers fleeing with squirming bundles in their arms. "No!" he roared, giving chase. But in the confusion of battle, the kidnappers slipped away into the alien jungle. In the aftermath, Douglas held Primus as she wept for their stolen children. His teeth clenched as he surveyed the devastation. "This ends now," he vowed silently. Gathering his most trusted warriors and a contingent of Even's combat drones, Douglas prepared to venture into the hostile wilderness. He studied the tactical readouts, formulating a plan to infiltrate Kolvek's hidden stronghold. "We move at dawn," he announced to his strike team. "Failure is not an option. We're bringing our children home." The jungle night pressed close as Douglas and his strike team crept through the underbrush. Sweat trickled down his neck, his muscles taut with anticipation. Ahead loomed the dark silhouette of Kolvek's fortress. A twig snapped. Douglas froze, signaling his team to halt. A purist sentry emerged from the shadows, scanning the area. Douglas held his breath, willing his racing heart to slow. The sentry passed within inches, oblivious to their presence. Once clear, Douglas gave the signal. His team surged forward, neutralizing the outer guards with brutal efficiency. As they breached the perimeter, Douglas turned to Captain Rix. "Remember the plan," he whispered. "I'll find the children. You take Kolvek." Rix nodded grimly, leading his squad towards the central complex. Douglas and his team descended into the bowels of the fortress, encountering sporadic resistance. They dispatched the fanatical warriors swiftly, driven by urgency. Finally, they reached the cell block. Douglas's blood ran cold at the sight. Rows of stasis tanks lined the walls, each containing a tiny, mutilated form. Surgical implements lay scattered on blood-stained tables. Several infants, their bodies horrifically altered, lay motionless on operating slabs. A primal roar tore from Douglas's throat. He charged the nearest scientist, slamming the man into a bank of monitors. His fists flew in a savage blur, years of pent-up rage exploding outward. "Sir!" a team member's shout snapped him back to reality. "We need to move!" Douglas staggered back, his hands shaking. He activated his comlink. "Even, we need extraction, now!" The AI's drones swarmed into the room, carefully transferring the surviving infants to secure pods. Douglas supervised the evacuation, his heart aching for those they couldn't save. Elsewhere in the complex, the sounds of battle echoed. Captain Rix and his team fought their way through waves of defenders, inching closer to Kolvek's inner sanctum. The door to the throne room exploded inward. Rix charged through the debris, locking eyes with the twisted zealot responsible for so much suffering. Kolvek sneered, drawing a wicked-looking blade. "Come to die, half-breed?" The two collided in a fury of strikes and counter-strikes. The room shook as they grappled, smashing through ornate furnishings. Blood spattered the walls as their blades found purchase. A tremor rocked the foundation. Cracks spiderwebbed across the ceiling. Rix, seeing his opportunity, lunged forward. His blade plunged deep into Kolvek's chest. The purist leader's eyes widened in shock. He toppled backward, his lifeblood pooling on the floor. As the light faded from Kolvek's eyes, Rix staggered out of the collapsing chamber. With their leader fallen, the remaining purists descended into chaos. Douglas and his team fought their way to the surface, the precious cargo of hybrid infants secured. They emerged into the humid night air, victory within grasp. Douglas began preparations for immediate evacuation when a blinding flash seared his retinas. The ground heaved beneath his feet as a massive explosion tore through the compound. Heat washed over him in suffocating waves. Douglas threw himself over the infant pods, using his body as a shield against the nuclear inferno. Searing pain enveloped him as his flesh blistered and burned. Through the haze of agony, Douglas fumbled for his emergency beacon. With the last of his strength, he activated the signal, praying it would be enough. As darkness closed in, Douglas's thoughts turned to Primus, to Alara and Hope. He had failed them, failed to protect all the children. Regret and anguish consumed him as consciousness slipped away. Hours later, Primus led a frantic search party through the smoldering ruins. Her heart pounded as she followed the beacon's signal. When she found Douglas, a cry of anguish tore from her throat. His body lay broken and charred, barely recognizable. The infant pods nearby contained only ashes. Primus gathered Douglas into her arms, refusing to accept the truth before her eyes. In desperation, she initiated the blood-bonding ritual, pressing her lips to his radiation-ravaged flesh. For agonizing moments, nothing happened. Then Douglas's body convulsed, his eyes snapping open as his cells regenerated at an impossible rate. "Primus!" he gasped, his voice raw and pained. "I'm here," she sobbed, cradling him close. But the miraculous revival was short-lived. Douglas's body began to break down, overwhelmed by the radiation damage. Alara and Hope rushed to his side, their enhanced minds grasping the gravity of the moment. "My daughters," Douglas whispered, his strength fading. "I'm sorry. I couldn't save them all." "You saved us, Father," Alara said, her voice wise beyond her years. "Live," Douglas pleaded, his gaze locked with Primus's. "Live and grow. It's the only way." With a final, shuddering breath, Douglas Wilson slipped away. Primus's anguished wail echoed through the devastated jungle. Days later, the Brunali gathered to lay Douglas to rest. As the funeral concluded, the weight of their uncertain future settled heavily upon them. Evan's holographic form materialized, its artificial voice somber. "We face a critical juncture," the AI intoned. "The hybrid children's accelerated evolution cannot be halted. You must decide their fate, and by extension the fate of your entire species." The Brunali sisterhood erupted into heated debate. Some argued for suppressing the hybrid's development, fearing subjugation. Others saw it as their only path forward, the culmination of everything they had sacrificed. Primus stood apart, torn between grief and duty. She gazed at Alara and Hope, marveling at their rapid growth and intelligence. In their eyes, she saw echoes of Douglas, his strength, his compassion, his unyielding hope for the future. The deciding vote fell to her. Primus approached the ballot box, her hand trembling as she reached for the datapad. The fate of two species rested on her choice. As she cast her vote, Primus's gaze fell upon the youngest of the hybrid infants. The child's tiny hand reached out, grasping Alara's finger. In that simple gesture, Primus saw the promise of a future yet unwritten.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.